The Shades of the Abyss. Book 1 of the Living Lore. Written by F. Lockhaven and E. J. Iller. Regarding the living lore. The living lore is not a book in the conventional sense. It does not instruct, it remembers. Records of its study are incomplete and frequently disputed. Some accounts describe clarity or revelation. These interpretations are unreliable. Prolonged exposure produces inconsistencies, lost time, altered recollections, and disagreement over events that no longer align. The archives maintain that the lore is inert. This position has followed every unsuccessful attempt to seal, destroy, or erase it from record. One observation appears consistently across surviving documentation. The lore responds to attention. It does not act with intent, nor does it distinguish between careful and careless readers. It persists. Its influence accumulates. The living lore alters context before content. History appears intact until it no longer does. For these reasons, all unsanctioned contact is recorded as a matter of consequence, not curiosity. Chapter 1. A young man awoke in his bed after a startling and impressive dream. As soon as he was up, before he even opened his eyes, rose from his position, or even let out a sigh from the comfort of his pillow, he leaned far to the side and reached for a quill pen on his nightstand to write with. A piece of paper was already prepared, and he blindly scribbled the details down. In those brief moments between dreaming and waking, Baxter Movish opened his eyes in a tight squint to greet the first morning light that crept in from the narrow slats of his window. The wooden blinds were drawn as tight as they could, but still let in the light he so resented every morning, just enough that he couldn't sleep past the first bells in the city. Once he finally opened his eyes and brushed the curls away from his face, he looked down and saw his writing hand had lazed onto the table, half numb and reeling with the pain of pins and needles. He shook it off and sat up properly on his bed. Another night had passed, which meant another day had started, and the plans for that day were what put him onto his feet. He redressed himself clumsily into his scholarly apparel, a classic tie-down petticoat over his regular, airy, wide-sleeve blouse, which he buttoned with detached collars over his wrists to keep the fabric out of the way of his working hands. His trousers reached down to his knees and tied into his socks, which rose from his feet. His shoes were buckled into place, except for the right one. It was just old enough that it was starting to wear out over his arch. "Well, that's wonderful," he sighed. He took the chance of speaking to clear his throat and get his voice reoriented into its ideal tone, deepened with his early, burgeoning maturity. If he cleared it enough times, he thought it wouldn't crack so much during the day into his younger, higher tones. With his garments assembled, he threw on his hooded robe and clasped it under his neck collar. It was still a junior's robe in size and standing, with a single line of gold trim at the bottom of the dark blue, hip-length fabric and another golden ring around the hood line. He stood in front of a full-height mirror that stood a bit taller than he did and admired his appearance. Perhaps today, he wondered aloud, Master Lothan will stop being coy and recommend me properly. He gave it a moment of thought, put his master in his mind, then sighed with a defeated expression. Or he'll tell me to wait until next year again. Baxter was prepared to move out immediately. He readied his mind and his heart for another day at the archive, but before he left, he remembered the passive writing he'd done while half asleep. His dream notes were on his nightstand, and he didn't want to wait until the evening to read them. What he wrote down was still half a mystery even to him, so he picked it up and prepared to gawk at his own terrible, illegible scrawls. "Dreamed of abyss," he read out loud. "Mountain and sea, shades, shadows, no bodies or light. Reference, the Old World Comp, Volume 6, Volume 8, Volume E, Demondemonium, Light and Dark Shadows." Baxter was an apprentice cryptographist, a reader of concealed words in ancient texts, made of languages from the ages of antiquity that had lapsed into legend. He'd read impossible stories told by real people in dictation that were reprinted by hand and kept in the archive for restoration and recontextualizing as both a duty and privilege of his position, all because he loved to read. He'd learned of all the world's most arcane legends and myths, and yet his own writing was the most confusing thing he'd ever read. "I suppose I'll give those a look over," he sighed. He put the paper down like he was disappointed in it for being incomprehensible, but at least he recognized a few things about it. It reminded him of the titles of books he still had to organize, all the more reason he had to leave for the day. He left his room and ambled down the stairs, ignoring the smell of cooked, greasy meat that wafted through the air. Meat was a slumber-inducing food, and he needed his mind to be racing as early as possible. However, his brothers and father felt a different way. "Oi, Baxi!" a voice called out. He turned at the foot of the stairs and saw the dining room full up with happy eaters, including some guests, friends of his brothers who came by before work. "Leaving already?" The caller was his oldest brother, the head worker of the city's renovations crew, Bart. Bart had eaten so much ham he appeared half pig in the haze of the early morning. He sweated easily and had a pudgy nose to match his pudgy arms, back, and waist. He held up a fork with a slab of wet ham and wiggled it around, causing the drippings to flicker out onto the floor for the cats to lick up. "We got food for you, too." "If he begs, maybe," another voice called out, gravely and ornery sounding. It came from his slovenly, bloated brother Barney, who wielded a loaf of bread in one hand and thick slabs of bacon in the other. Fork not required. Just seeing meat, cooked or raw, in his brother's greasy hands made Baxter visibly grimace, which his brothers were fast to notice. "Oh, go on then," Bart called out. "Eat your books. You love them so much. Get some roughage in you." The table then started chanting, "Roughage, roughage," over and over until Baxter was out of the house. He sighed and took a pause at the door to calm his mind. His family, the only family that he had in the world, seemed to only exist to mock him for his own given talents and his steady learned skills. He was the only one in the house who could read, including his mother and father. Each morning he left with that solitude on his shoulder, like a weight he couldn't shake. A burden of responsibility that mocked him in his own home. His home was located in the festival quarter, as it was called. It was the kindest way the city planners could think to phrase the slums near the base of the city where the day workers, laborers, and uneducated families all lived. The richer, more advantaged classes all lived up the hill toward the old royal quarter, which had once been home to the nobles. Even without the presence of a king, a monarchy, or any kind of single ruling party, the old ways persisted, as they always did. Chicheri was a grand city, a corner state in the Vincian Empire, one of the 7 great cities of the high world. It was a place where trade began and ended, not a port town or a travel-through place like others were. Merchants lived in Chicheri. Their headquarters were in the trade quarter, esteemed and regal palaces that rivaled the old noble houses further up the hill. As such, the city prospered as many others did, all affected by the great age of enlightenment that spread across the lands. It was a time where the wars of old had long since ended, and the wounds they had opened were healed over, but not forgotten. The legacies that the ancestors and noble families brought from the old world were rooted in and gave birth to the flowering trees of industry over time. The city was built on the wealth of that knowledge, the knowledge espoused in the many legends and in the songs and plays performed to commemorate that historic past. Knowledge was the most important currency, even rivaling gold. So, despite his lower-class upbringing, Baxter consistently felt like he was the richest of the rich because he knew what few others could ever learn. After reflecting on his surroundings, he looked up and began marching up the street until he left the humble trappings of his low-born home and made his way into the arts district. It was an age of art, an era of creation and creativity the likes of which had never been recorded in history. The piece brought more than monetary prominence to Vincia. It also brought purpose to its people's idle hands, allowing them to give their talent and skills to a higher plane of existence than what they physically could see. It was an era ruled by the mind and not the body, although, from Baxter's perspective, things were still very much swayed by the bodies of others, at least in the festival quarter. "Baxter!" someone called out. Baxter turned and saw someone heading his way, a tall and strong-looking man whose height and observable layers of muscles betrayed the fact that he was Baxter's age, and no older. Derek Solly, his childhood friend, ran up with a chunk of marble stone hoisted up onto his shoulder that weighed at least 100 pounds, if not more, and he treated it like it was a basket of laundry. "Careful, Derek," Baxter warned, shying away from his friend's dangerous workload. "You could crush a man flat with that." Derek looked over and rubbed his cheek against the stone. "Oh, this?" he asked. No, it's fine here. It's not going anywhere, and I'm safe already, see?" He tried to angle himself down and pointed at the space between the rock and his shoulder. Baxter saw a padded blanket serving as the brace that kept his arm from breaking against the weight, but questioned its effectiveness on keeping Derek's face safe. "It can't go sliding around like this, yeah?" "Good thinking," Baxter approved. "What's it for, though?" "So, there's a guy," Derek began, "trying to carve a woman's bust. I mean, like, the bust of her bust, but from up her—" "I get it," Baxter interrupted. "He's the son of a merchant, but wants to be a sculptor and stuff, and he keeps messing up, and the woman he's sculpting keeps getting pissy and yelling that his work's all wrong. And he snapped back once at her, saying it's his art, and his interpretation is closer to truth than what he sees or something. So she socks him right in the nose, tells him to start over for the 9th time already. He's buying up marble from the quarry wholesale, skipping the markets, and we're getting full price." "Noblemen are certainly generous," Baxter said sarcastically. "Kinda skittish, though," Derek added, countering Baxter's backhanded compliment. "Well, he may not pay you if it breaks," Baxter warned again. "Yeah, I got it," Derek said, hoisting it up to make it look somehow safer in his already controlled arms. "Aye, find a heavy book today and pick it up over your head. You'll feel better." "I'll try that," Baxter called out. He kept on his way, feeling his chest grow a little lighter. Derek was his oldest friend, and the only man without literacy that Baxter felt he could get close to. Derek didn't care for the arts or culture or anything that he seemed to most commonly work on, but he was strong, in body and heart. Friendly to anybody, regardless of their class or standing, Derek never looked down on anyone, nor spoke out against those who looked down on him. On his final approach to the archive, a building he could see for blocks around that oriented him around the city every day, Baxter neglected to look directly ahead and ran into someone. The impact caused him to stumble backward, and his shoe buckle popped open, causing him to fall right out of it and slip onto his back. He sighed when he landed. The frustration was greater than his pain, and he sat up to see who he had offended with his negligence. Curiously, the one who stood before him was a girl. She wore a well-kept green dress with an apron that had the symbol of the Porter Guild on it, a covered wagon circled by a coil of ivy. She looked upset but unshaken, and judging by the force of their collision, also as sturdy as the marble chunk that Derek was carrying. "Do excuse yourself," she said. "I can't wait forever." "Oh, sorry," Baxter replied. He stayed sitting and reached over for his shoe. His trousers were dusty, he realized. He struggled to latch the buckle again, as it had clearly broken the whole way through, and his pause caused the girl to give a very impatient, tired sigh. "If you can't apologize properly, then pay better attention," she demanded. "Of course I will," he said. "Of course." She huffed and stormed away. Baxter finally got up after forcing the buckle shut at the expense of his freedom. His shoe was essentially locked in place with no way to free it but cutting the leather. He looked on as the girl left and carved a path ahead of her out of the busy but hastily retreating travelers who didn't want to stand in her way. If only he'd looked ahead, he would have done the same. The merchant guilds and their workers had the right of way on every road, even through the royal quarter. The Porter Guild was responsible for deliveries throughout the city. They brought goods to important businesses or private estates that came from all over the country and even transported imports from the Old World. They were contracted by very high-paying and esteemed people, so the contents of what they carried were highly valued. In another town or another part of Chechery, a girl like her would be the target of some maligned and criminal mind who valued her goods far more than her own well-being. Baxter considered such a crook unfortunate to go against her, though. She carried herself with more assertion than Derek did. At last, with no further distractions, Baxter reached Main Street, a road that stretched all the way from the gatehouse of the old, historic lower town that used to be the whole of the city to the great castle above, which hosted the new enlightened rulers of the countryside in their mountainous corner of Vincia. Cathedral Row, the lane lined with castle-like churches, was the main thoroughfare of all trade and foot traffic. It was the central road that connected all of the city together and ran uphill in winding grades for horse and cart, and offered mounting stairs for the fleet of foot. Baxter cut across the street, went up one terrace of the hill by the steps, and walked straight up to the archive. It was one of the largest cathedrals, owning the tallest tower of any building in the city. It was once owned by the priesthood, who attempted to use their position as the highest place in all of Chechery to connect the living world with the realm of divinity, like a great mountain that rose out of the oceans to touch the sacred sky and extract the power of light for themselves. That was what the legends and the diaries of the builders said, at least. After the age of conquest ended and the last wars finished off, the site was abandoned by its former sponsors and was returned to the control of the ruling emperor of Chechery, who at the time was a wise man who valued knowledge of the world over the potential of the divine. And so it was that the largest cathedral of its time would become the archive of all written works, old and new. A library of all human history, from myths to more recent musings of philosophy from the great thinkers of the City of Minds, was stored inside. Baxter took a breath and readied himself to enter again. There were no jockish brutes, dangerous lifting, or intimidating merchants inside the halls of the archive. There were only books. All he had to do was learn. Chapter 2. There were no walls visible in the archive, only shelves stacked to the 4-story ceiling with books, scrolls, and assemblies of papers that had been collected and collated into bindings over centuries of arduous reclamation work. Factions across the high world and collaborators in the old world had all gathered together over the age of conquest to hoard the texts of fallen civilizations, lost tribes, and the contemporary works of the poets and artists that sprang forth to commemorate the lauded pasts. The result was a massive storage of knowledge, the most in all the world. For people with time to spare, it was a blessing to have all the information at hand they could ever desire, to learn about the world that passed them by in their daily lives. For those who worked there, it was a burden, since not all the information was so willingly given. The nature of restrictions that layered every single book within the archive was not based on any rights or cultural passage. Anyone who could read was welcome to peruse through the many halls of tomes, provided that the tomes were still physically readable, and far too many were not. Age had stricken the collection, and many of the great works of the past approached dilapidation and disrepair. The best among them were given new covers and spines by the binders, but the worst had to be restored letter by letter into new manuscripts by the scribes. That was Baxter's job. He didn't just read, he rewrote. It was his duty to read the books that couldn't be opened without losing pages and copy the contents down into newer compendiums, one painful page at a time. Baxter's pain was constant, dulling, and monotonous. The mental strain rivaled the physical as each day blended into the last, and all the information swirled together in a mesh within his mind. It was no surprise that his dreams were incomprehensible when written out, since the work of his day required his thoughts to be the same way. But he persevered, never faltering, always steadfast, and never speaking but to practice the pronunciations of the passages he found most interesting. He, along with all the other scribes and binders and painters, loved learning. Baxter went straight to work as soon as he entered. Each scribe had a little office off in the side rooms, once used for communal eating, bathing, or the various activities the priesthood of the cathedral had to tend to in order to maintain their massive building project. The tower that the cathedral hosted, which later came to be worshipped in its own right, was the central pillar around which most of the books were stacked. It had become a rounded library shelf, and walkways were built to trace along the architecture like a wooden spider web that surrounded it on many levels. Anyone afraid of heights was forbidden from working there. If they were, they would never be able to retrieve the books stored at the highest point of the archive to work on them. Baxter's station consisted of a simple, stout, and wooden desk. He was just tall enough that he didn't have to hunch to do his work, unless the book itself was large or taller than it was wide. At his side was a quill pen, and aside that was a well of ink drilled directly into the wooden frame of the desk and covered with a thin sheet of window glass. The black bar on the side measured his progress through the day, as well as his storage of ink to write with. When it lost its shimmer, he knew it was running low, which happened no less than 3 times a day. If he were working on something that intrigued him or something of great importance put onto him by his master, one of the attendants would refill it for him while he worked. The books he was working on were all chronicles from the old world, legends of wars between tribes near the deep sea, a region he'd learned about previously from old trade documents, diaries of soldiers during the wars in the Age of Conquest, fishermen parables, creation myths, abyssal lore, and other such readings. Despite never having seen them, he had read about the old world countries outside of the Vincian Empire so many times from so many sources he felt like he'd already explored them to death. The only thing he hadn't seen but wanted to were the fantastical legends of magic. But stories were stories, and the written word was never entirely true. Even the biography of a man could tell as many lies as the tall tale spun by that man's own neighbor. In the course of his day, Baxter would copy down thousands upon thousands of words by hand. From a labor point of view, what he did was just as strenuous and taxing on his body as the heavy lifting Derek did, just in different ways. His writing arm was lean and taut all the way up to his wrist. Even in the spring of his youth, before he'd even turned 20 and been considered a full-fledged adult by society, he'd battled with the pains and the creaking joints of a far more aged man. Most of the men working in the archive suffered similar issues. Baxter's talent for learning propelled him into the position at a very young age. He had been working for nearly a year at that point, so the luster of his presence had worn off on the rest of the archive staff. "Oh, Baxter," a lady said as she passed by. One of the custodians responsible for carrying books from their shelves to the tables and replacing older copies with the newly restored revisions tapped the corner of his desk. "Master Lothan asked for you to come by during your first break. He wants to speak with you." "All right," Baxter said. When he looked up and listened to her, he was suddenly immersed in the sounds of scrawling pens upon pages, trailing ink around in infinitely complex shapes and characters, like thousands of cats screeching at a mighty stone wall. "I'll try to keep track of that." "Okay," she said. She went off to her duties while Baxter began his. He looked to the side, to a row of hourglasses held in rotating wheels with labels beneath them. Each measured a different amount of time and had different purposes. The largest one determined breaks, which happened every 4 hours, and each worker was afforded 2 throughout the day. Most scribes stayed 8 hours at most, yet a few stretched their time out to 10 out of love for the work and to be in the good graces of their superiors. Baxter was a special case, however, and planned to stay for 12 hours each day. He was the apprentice master archivist, directly working under Master Lothan the Learned. Once his first break came around, signaled by the chime of a bell that the hourglass made once all of its weight hit its bottom half, Baxter stood up and assessed the work he had completed. His pace was average, but his work was always flawless, and he made one extra step of effort as he wrote from page to page. He read the work itself. He didn't just write the words as he saw them, but he understood them as well, and on rare occasions in which the authors of ancient history were mistaken or too hasty in their own recollections, he corrected their grammar and spelling too. Only for the most common words, though. Names and places or strange ideas stayed as they were. He had read in the vast journal he had just replicated about a man's travel to a craggy range of mountains. There was the fabled country of Hassa in the Old World, home to the source of all the world's evils and the birthplace of shades, the apparitions responsible for all of mankind's plagues and unseen hardships. All malaise, anxiety, anger, and hatred born into men's hearts unprompted was born from shades, or so the man had reckoned, and so he sought the place of their birth, the mouth of the abyss. It wasn't particularly exciting, but the mention of the abyss gave Baxter a slight chill. It reminded him of his mid-waking scribbles, the mad unconscious ramblings of his mind put onto paper as a reminder for him to try and read more about it. One way or another, his dreaming self was being fulfilled. He kept it in mind as he hiked the long walk from the scribe alley, past the halls of shelves, and into the sacred tower, which served as the keep for all the most important and valuable books in the archive, tended to only by the most trusted staff as selected by the master archivist himself. The inside of the tower, which was once a place of worship, became just another corner for dry storage of the historic materials. Books were only piled up if they could endure the weight and contact of other books. Most were spread out and kept totally separate. Some were even kept in chests that took up space on every floor of the steep, high tower. The stairs spiraled upward, and every 7 feet a new floor was built and was likewise covered with books. Places of worship, once meant to feel closer to an ancient god, were just convenient spaces where moisture wasn't a problem. It was so temperate that mold eventually stopped growing outright on any books afflicted and would in time die and become flakes of dust upon the pages. The master archivist was always somewhere near the top or at the very top itself. The tower was twice as tall as the cathedral, reaching nearly 100 feet off the ground. It was like walking all the way uphill to get to the archive itself all over again. Baxter endured the steps and stopped his mind from wandering into discontent with thoughts of the books he'd read or still had to read. His mind was tied up with questions about the abyss and its nature in mythology. He wondered if such a place were real in the vast expanse of the explored world. An ocean without light beneath the ground, and a mountain that connected its lifeless denizens to the world above. Literally, it seemed impossible, but it had to have some greater meaning, at least enough to invade his dreams. If anyone knew the deeper meanings of ancient lore, it would be Master Lothan. Baxter finally reached the floor where his master dwelled and saw the man pick up a book with a firm, steady grip on its pages. He turned, and his beard turned with him, gray around the mouth and black just inches away from his face. His age ate away at the color of his hair from the roots, but his solid, youthful face persisted, with only wrinkles present where he smiled. "There you are," he said. "I was worried you might have forgotten again." "Not today," Baxter replied as he caught his breath. "Master, what do you need of me?" "Today," Lothan spoke with some importance, "is the day you expand your repertoire of skills for the archive. Starting tomorrow, you will begin work in an apprenticeship as a binder." "A binder," Baxter repeated in disbelief. "And we shall start with this book," Lothan said. He held the mighty tome outward, and in his presentation, his grip loosened just enough that a page from the middle slipped out, then another, then several more, and then the entire book's contents, aside from the few pages still held on near the beginning and end, spilled out onto the floor like an overturned bucket of water. Baxter watched it happen, all emotion gone from his face, and he turned to leave. "That was an accident," Lothan exclaimed. He put the shell of the book on the table at his side and bent over to pick the pages up. "Hurry, Baxter, get the pages before they— Ah! Master?" Baxter saw Lothan fall onto his side with his arms stuck in place. "My back," Lothan groaned. "I think I pulled it." "Picking up paper?" Baxter asked. "Go down and get Pharcellus," Lothan bade, wagging his arms from his crumpled position on the floor. He's a masseuse. He can fix this." Baxter took a few steps down, just enough that he could lean his arms on the floor of the room and peer through the slats of the banister that shielded the stairs from sudden falls. "Can't you just lie flat and stretch?" "Come on, boy," Lothan argued. "It's just a quick up and down again. This is important." "What if I pull my legs and fall all the way down the tower from here?" Baxter asked nonchalantly. Lothan looked through strained eyes at the boy who had become nonplussed by his anguish. So he stopped. He straightened up his back, stopped pretending, and stood back up. "You're getting too smart," Lothan said, taking a lecturing tone suddenly. "Seeing through my blunders is one thing, but if you end up strictly analyzing every facet of life, you'll become disappointed with it in no time. Now, He looked down at the floor and pointed around. His voice became much quieter but still authoritative. "Help me, please." "Yes, master," Baxter said. They picked the pages up, reordered them, and for the rest of that day, Baxter worked under Lothan the Learned on the careful and precarious art of binding books together again. He lamented the loss of his preferred duty of scribe work, but it was all part of the necessary steps he had to take. It was his ambition to become an archivist like his mentor, and it was his mentor's desire to see that ambition through. Together, they worked awfully long to repair the damaged book, and by the time they were done, it was evening, and the rest of the day workers at the archive had been dismissed home. Baxter left as well, and only after setting foot outside in the setting sun did he realize with anguish that he had forgotten to ask Lothan all of his questions. "That darned paper gag," he hissed under his breath. He pulled up his hood over his head and tucked the rim over his eyes. His master's charismatic, jovial attitude had once again disrupted what Baxter thought was the more important act of learning. It wasn't unusual, but was always frustrating. At least in Baxter's mind, when he became the master archivist, such things would never have to happen again. At least the day had not concluded without some further adventure in learning. As he and Lothan had pieced the book back together, he managed to glean some knowledge from it, particularly about the founding of Vincia. The book turned out to be a tome of the old wars, a collection of reports from battles arranged chronologically, which served his and his master's purposes well in reordering the fallen pages. The book told of the eventual rise of the guild house of the Vinci family, which went on to become the military and economic power that led a collection of allied city-states to victory against the standing armies of foreign foes. Every day he learned something new, and so every day he drew closer to his goal just by doing what was expected of him. Never any adventures or hard trials of battle, but by reading through them after the fact, he managed to piece together the meaning behind them. It made him not want for travel or expeditions into the unknown, because all that knowledge was already collected before him in the form of books. All he had to do was read, and his life felt well lived. Chapter 3. A young woman with hair tied up in a short bun behind her head and an apron marked with the Porters Guild crest walked down the street with a basket swinging in her hand. Idle Lown walked home from her busy day of bussing packages up and down the great Chicheri streets from one quarter of the city to another. She had a stern face, holding back a great scowl from her pursed lips. Her final compensation at her long day's end was a paltry dinner. Inside the basket was a baked quail breast with stale bread rolls and a shallow cup of fried cabbage and carrots that was left over from the Guildhall kitchen, all wrapped up together in a cheesecloth covering to keep it warm. It was all she could get with her pocket money. The Porters Guild was important, but that didn't make them rich. Most of their money went to various insurance agencies they had to appease just to keep the prominence of their business within the city walls. Without such certifications, noble families and other merchant houses wouldn't allow them to handle their important exotic goods. To stay in business, they had to bleed out all the money they had every day while the rest of the city, laborers and scholars alike, took home the full share of their working wages for themselves. The dilemma that plagued Idle's family had embittered her greatly. She spent each night walking home, with spite visible on her brow, such that no one dared approach her, not even with cruel intentions. There was no doubt in the harshest criminal's mind that she would make the loudest, messiest scene despite her standing, and nothing was worse for a passing criminal than a junction made by the Guild's private justice system. The porter's house she belonged to was near the old town at the base of the city. It was just in sight of the historic ward's ancient walls, the last and latest line of defense ever arisen since the age of conquest so long ago. They blocked the sun as it rose, which caused her to wake every morning in the dark to start her day. Just another inconvenience that stirred up malcontent in her heart. By the end of it all, when her waking hours expired and exhaustion took its hold, she knew she would be too tired to even feel her hatred, and that lapse into an emotionless tiredness was what she valued most. Not hating the world was what she considered close to being asleep. She wandered inside the single-floor home connected to the two-story carriage garage and looked around. Some candles were lit, but it appeared that no one was home. The interior was wide open. Walls to the garage and bedrooms on the opposite side were the only things blocking her vision. It was a home fitting for one of the lower families, the unfortunate ones who were paid to walk instead of paid to send others out on the porting. A lower family, even in the upper class of merchants, was no different than a laborer's family, and as porters, they couldn't even read their own contracts to renegotiate. It didn't bother her at all to be home alone. It gave her enough time to come down from the inconveniences of her day in a safe way, without needing to listen to her father's constant beaten-down lectures. All he talked about was the old family pride, the way of the guilds, the duty they had to uphold, the honor in service. It was all defeated talk from a man she thought couldn't sink any lower down the social ladder. She was ashamed of her father and felt no shame of her own in that belief. As long as she was stuck in Chicheri with him, she had to find ways to make the best of it. So, dinner alone it was. She sat down and arranged her food on the table with the cloth. The cabbage was stuck to the bread, which wasn't stale any longer, but overly moistened and falling apart. The quail was warm to the touch at best, and all the herbs it had been baked with had withered up and stuck to the cloth as it unraveled. Nevertheless, it was food, and she enjoyed it voraciously. She plucked and tore her way through it, not needing a fork for how soft it all was, and thought back on one incident that stuck out from her day. The run-in, physically, with the boy. He had on fancy clothes like a scholar, except for his broken shoe. He was distracted and morose as well. She couldn't imagine what kind of stress he was put through to make him so inattentive that he not only ran into her, but did so with enough force to topple over. She was only sturdy in the encounter because her training as a porter made her walk with hard steps and unshaken confidence at a powerful pace. She had sure footing at all times, ensuring that the safety of even the most delicate package would not be compromised. Even if he had been carrying a boulder, she wouldn't have been put off center. Once her food was done, she bundled it up into its cloth and went to stow it in the bin with the rest of the day-to-day refuse. She went out behind the garage to place it in the bin and stood for a moment to admire the night sky and the perpetual twilight shimmer of the gas lamps and reflective miles of lit windows in the distance. Night never truly came in Chicheri. Someone somewhere always had to be awake for some reason. The only thing keeping her from being a night porter and making deliveries between waking hours was the training it required. The criminals and thugs of the day were paltry obstacles compared to the unspoken, but not underestimated, criminals of the night. While she stood outside, she heard something familiar but out of place, the sound of wheels clattering back and forth and the clopping of an impatient horse inside. The garage was meant to be closed past a certain hour. Once the sun went down, there was nothing for her house to take in. Her father wasn't a night porter either. He was too old and timid to try. No packages were meant to come in until morning at the earliest, and yet it sounded like someone was inside. She had to investigate. It was her business, in a sense. Her father handled the contracts and exchanged the money, but whatever was happening, she would inevitably have to take control of it. She snuck into the garage from the side entrance, where the room led out into the street for easy access, right next to her home's back door. She had gone that way many times before, and knew that the door opened immediately to a narrow, walled-in stairway that went to the upper deck, which looked down on the wagons from above. She snuck up and stayed low in a crawl up the steps until her head was just barely peeking over the floor at the top of the stairs. No one was there, so she kept herself low and edged just close enough to the railing to see down to the ground. The carriage in the garage was loaded up with crates and barrels, and from Idle's position they looked unmarked. Without an approved crest from a merchant guild, no one could ship things in or out of the city, which meant it had to be local, but the cart itself looked foreign. It didn't have the same ergonomic design that she was accustomed to seeing. It was too long, past regulations. The wheels had metal studs on the inside of the rim that stuck out just a bit from the main spokes, like it was built wrong or built dangerously on purpose. Down below, she saw two figures talking, and when she relaxed her breathing enough, she could just hear them. One was a mystery and spoke in whispers, just out of sight in the shadow from where the lanterns lit the building. The other was her father, bearded, slumped over, and looking especially tired just standing in place. She kept crawling forward to eavesdrop. Whatever the deal was, she had to know its value. "We can't cover for the cost of travel," her father said. Mr. Lawn made plaintive motions with his hands, palms up, wrists forward, natural extensions of his bartering ways to show complacency and pleading with his apparently dissatisfied customer. The figure in question was cloaked from head to foot in midnight blue that twisted and wound up, revealing little of its form. Its face was hidden in darkness, aided by the shadows of its makeshift hood. "Not without the toll stamps from the main roads." "We travel not," the figure said in a hissing whisper, a voice made by speaking while breathing in. "Overwatched roads. We must spurn the light to stay as shadows." Okay," her father replied. He looked back at the carriage just as some of the items on board began to jitter and move. The barrel lids unfastened, the crates slowly disassembled and quietly fell apart, and a darkness rose out like black water spilling from every container. Up stood a gathering of black-clad folks, shiny like a midnight lake, and the darkness that birthed them spilled out onto the floor and vanished. There was at least a dozen, as Idle counted. She was more horrified by the emergence than curious, and wasn't prepared to calculate with rationality the math required. "The fare remains unadjusted from our discussion," the figure said. "The cargo, here, shall be dispersed. The wagon is, too, a form of the payment." "I can't accept that," Mr. Lawn said. The figure drew in a ragged breath. "Not ungratefully, mind you, I am grateful. It's a fine wagon. It can haul many things, but there are procedures I have to follow. I can't break every rule for you," Mr. Lawn exclaimed. "You see the folly of the light," the figure said. It put a hand, armored in a gauntlet with sharp fingertips, on her father's shoulder, which stopped his objections along with his breath. "You see the worth of the dark. These rewards shall be a pittance after the final endeavor. We will not forget you when our mission is complete. The Lawn family shall be the only one remaining once the darkness has taken hold." "Yes," Mr. Lawn finally muttered. Idle couldn't believe what she had heard, the short, sharp complacency against such an ominous and mysterious threat. She kept watching as the dark figures slowly departed from the wagon's back. Most of them were slim and featureless. Their armor was silent and shiny against their dark skin, like spandex that covered them from the neck down. They moved backward more comfortably and aptly than they did moving forward, when they went by creeping and slinking with their arms reaching outward. One stood out, aside from the traitor. That one was fully armored, its midnight skin nearly unseen, and despite the heavy plating sheathing its form, the being made no sound jumping down from the back of the wagon. Only the slight creaking of wheels that gave way beneath its weight made a sound, just loud enough to startle both of the Lawns in their respective positions. The armored figure let out a long, deep breath that trailed slowly into a sick groan, like a weighted hinge on an old door that creaked more loudly the slower it was opened. "Lord Victus," the traitor said. The armored one, so named, turned his head, rounded with a crown of 5 sharp points like a clawed hand that reached up from his brow. His eyes shone deep blue under the dark cover of his visor. "By your honor, seal the contract with this light-born man." Victus hummed. He approached Mr. Lawn, who retreated in tiny half-steps, seeming unable to run but obviously desperately wanting to. Victus took both hands to Mr. Lawn's shoulders, then moved them up to his head and held him in place. Victus stood taller and stronger than her father, an ethereal being standing before the guildsman. As Victus stared, his eyes went brighter until they flashed with a bolt of blue into Mr. Lawn's eyes. The man yelped in a panic and lowered his voice immediately. He started to blink rapidly and reached his hands up to try to tend to his eyes. There was no pain. Once Victus released him, his body started to relax, and he looked up to his patron again. "See as we see," Victus said, his voice a basal growl, like great stone dragging across the ground. "Watch for our sign." Victus made a motion in the air with his finger extended. It did nothing in plain sight, but Mr. Lawn marveled at it, as his eyes could see the motions he made of an unknown character, as indecipherable to him as any language was. 2 circles, one large below, one narrow above, and a pillar connecting them, which grew from the bottom, all made with a single unstopped motion. "Have a nice day, then," Mr. Lawn said. Victus turned and threw out his arm. His men, including the traitor, ran for the rear garage door that led out into the street. Victus looked up to the walkway above briefly, before he followed after them. Idle had already seen enough. She left before they did, after her father was attacked. She had heard and seen all she needed at that point and raced back into the home to hide. What she knew was simple, and she ignored all the importance of the visitors or the nature of their being. Her place in the Porters' Guild was now compromised due to this illegal trafficking, and it was all her father's fault. She kept herself locked in her small room, just big enough for her bed and her wardrobe, and fearfully mulled over what she would say to him in the morning. Her issues went far beyond normal disappointment. It was a matter of life and death. Chapter 4. Another day in Chechery, another sprawl of workers and traffic moving by foot, by horse, and by cart along the winding ways. Baxter awoke once more, half asleep, with his hand already writing. His new dream revelation was far simpler than before and less ominous. He awoke to the sunlight and read before dressing. 160 pages face down, 161 pages face up, 80 stitches, 50 braided wire, like the backside of a horse. Fell again. Fell again. Tower too tall, too tall, too tall. The most sensible gibberish he'd ever produced. It made him crack a smile. All he could think about in his dreams was his master's antics. His first binding work yesterday started with the heightened mood of his master's impractical joking. He knew it wasn't intentional. The book was old enough to spill out its contents, but the follow-up was what kept Baxter interested. The chance to lightly and politely torment his master over his slow, long recovery would have been funnier than staying to bat away his false injury. If he obeyed him then, he'd become the fool when he arrived with help into the tower, where Lothan would no doubt be dancing or prancing around like he was 20 years younger. He dressed himself like normal, but slowed down once ready to clasp his hood. He was sighing more than normal, almost as a replacement for breathing. The work he was expected to do was not the same. It was different. Not worse or better, but not what he'd expected. He'd gotten so used to the scribe work and the benefits that came with it of learning as he read that it felt like a setback to do something else instead. He could still read the work as he repaired it, but without the ease that came with copying it down. He learned better when his hand was moving to make words appear on pages, and less well during slow, precise sewing work. All just a step at a time, Baxter said to remind himself. Even Master has to bind books. He scribes, he custodes. I can do it all too. Baxter nodded to himself in his mirror and went back to his nightstand on reflex. He already had his paper turned over and looked at the backside of it, where the previous night's ominous scrawlings were. He stared at the words all stretched out and biggened by his sleepy hand and focused hard on the one that was written in the smallest font, but was still precisely readable. Demondemonium. A word so odd, even reading it a day later gave him no context for it. I'll forget, Baxter said, unless I have it. He folded up the page and slipped it into his breast pocket. He'd ask Master about it in the hopes of learning more, even if his words wouldn't reach him. Of all the people in all of the Vincian Empire, the Master Archivist was the likeliest person to know any word, no matter how foreign or vague it was. With that, Baxter went out, endured light jeering from his siblings again, and marched through the streets at a rapid pace to get to the archive before anyone could call on him for duties. He had to get to Master Lothan before his work began, or he might not get the chance that day. Well, well, Derek said. He caught up with Baxter immediately using his long strides and strong legs. Did you happen to read about exercise in a book, and now you're trying it out? Baxter was merely walking with speed, not hiking his legs up to run or jog, while Derek just looked like he was walking normally without strain. No harm in being early, Baxter replied. You've got it lucky then, Derek said. Did you hear about the first Western yet? The old cathedral? Baxter asked. The cathedral was one of the oldest built on the westernmost part of the city. Its only windows faced the west, to endear a minor cult who worshipped at twilight, so their hall would only receive the light of the setting sun. They believed the sun could rise from the west after it sank, and in doing so would allow them to reverse the flow of time itself, which would enable them to travel into the past and correct grave mistakes. They were one of the loonier cults that had settled in Chicheri, second perhaps to the tower builders. It got sacked, Derek informed him. Baxter slowed his pace a bit. The weight of the history he'd rehearsed to himself felt like walking against a stiff wind. Not too badly, at least, Derek added. Work to be done, though. I never worked on a cathedral properly. Anything I ought to know about it first? Nothing they won't tell you, Baxter said. If any of the worshippers there are commissioning you, they'll likely ask you to attend their sun-setting service to hear their gospel. That's how most of the ministries recruit laborers to their congregations, sometimes with free food or drink as well. Shame for them then, Derek said. I don't have the attention for any more churches. Derek started a jog and easily left Baxter's side. He waved goodbye as he went on his way, too tall to disappear into the crowd until he was around a corner. It was just the motivation Baxter needed to keep his head up high. That, and the unfortunate recollection of yesterday's run-in with the girl. He had managed to repair his shoe, but it felt looser just thinking about it. Once he reached the archive, he was pleased to see it mostly underoccupied. The custodians and librarians were there, sorting through the many books stacked and layered high above that needed to be done that day. No one was guarding the central tower. It either meant the door was locked and the master wasn't in, or he was in, and no one wanted to bother him. Baxter, of course, had special permission to enter, and was often entrusted, as one of the few trusted enough to enter the tower unbidden, to fetch Master Lothan from meetings and guests who came by. It was locked, which shook up Baxter's plan a bit, but he was undeterred. His master basically lived in the archive. It seemed impossible to consider him absent. He stepped back and put his hands on his hips, looking around. He turned left, right, then stretched his neck up and saw something falling at him from above. He jumped a few steps back and watched a pile of paper descend from a walkway far above and then splash onto the ground where he had been standing. "Ah, there you are!" Lothan's voice echoed from above. Baxter looked up and saw his master leaning over the railing. "That one was on purpose. Bring those pages up to me and order them as you walk." "I'm not catching you if you fall," Baxter called back. "Very good to know," Lothan responded with a spry laugh. It was odd to see him out of the tower, but not so odd to see him in great spirits when he was. The enormity of his work was a great burden on the old man. He didn't just scribe and bind old books, he had to translate them as well, as he was a master of many old languages. When he worked in the tower, he was closer to the morose and dreary nature of his responsibilities. When he was out and in the light with everyone else, he was far happier. Baxter managed to sort the pages on his way up the stairs and across the walkways just in time to approach Master Lothan, who was flipping the pages of a small journal with one hand while holding the empty binding of Baxter's book with the other. While he wasn't watching, Baxter slipped his note out from his shirt and slid it into the assorted pages. His master got the drop on him, so he would return the favor with his hanging query. "It happens more than you think," Lothan explained. He pointed up quickly. "A book can fall from such a height that no part is left intact. The work of a binder isn't just making old pages look new again with fancier covers. It's important." "I can see why," Baxter replied. He handed the pages over. "Check them over if you like." "I very much would," Lothan retorted. He tucked the journal and the bindings underneath both of his arms and hugged them to his sides as he flipped through the pages one by one. Soon he came to the folded-up note between the papers and paused on it. "Out of order?" Baxter asked, feigning ignorance. Lothan gave him a stern look, seeing right through him, and pulled the note out. "What is this?" "Oh," Baxter exclaimed somewhat falsely. "That must have fallen out of my pocket when I was bent all the way over, using my back to lift and sort the papers out. Yes, that's mine. I meant to talk to you about it yesterday." "I feel like this was not so much an accident," Lothan said, "as much as a desperate grab for my attention." "I can't disprove your theory," Baxter replied. "And what is it?" Lothan unfolded the note and looked it over. Baxter nodded and decided to drop his act and treat it with the seriousness that he believed it warranted, to prove to his master that it wasn't a simple tit for tat, but a deeply urged curiosity and an opportunity to learn. "I take blank papers home with me," Baxter explained, "to practice writing, but also I keep one by my bed, and just before I fully wake each morning, I write down everything I remember from my dreams. This is one that made me curious." "Fell again," Lothan read aloud, interrupting Baxter's explanation. His eyes perked up, and he heightened his tone. Fell again? Too tall, tall, tall. The other side, Baxter instructed. Of course. Lothan flipped the sheet over with a phony smile and looked at the other side. His expression changed immediately. The humor was gone. He became more intense and then looked upon the words with a held-back hatred. I don't recall ever knowing of such books, Baxter said, related to the lore of the abyss. And that phrase, demondemonium. I can't help but feel I may have seen or heard of it before. I wrote it out from a dream, after all. Like you saw, it's something stuck in my memory somewhere. No, Lothan muttered quietly. He folded up the dream note and held it out for Baxter to take. Know what? Baxter asked. I haven't heard of it, Lothan answered. I think perhaps you read too much in the course of your work as a scribe. Another fair reason to keep you as a binder for some time to help your mind clear out of the unsettling histories you've read about. Well, hold on, Baxter began, but Lothan wagged the paper at him, and he took it and folded it back into his shirt pocket. Lothan wrapped up their conversation prematurely by stuffing the pages into the binding under his arm and pressing them together, ready to hand them off to Baxter once he was ready to listen. I'm sorry to judge, Master, Baxter said, but you don't seem to have the attitude of a man who knows nothing. In fact, I dare to say, you seem to know something and have made it clear to keep me out of it. You read far too much, Lothan chastised with a small smirk. But some knowledge can't be gained from a book, including the understanding of when and where to best use one's knowledge. There are times and places for such things, dear boy, but you can't know them from just gleaning through texts all day. As you say, Baxter said, disappointed. Do you know why I am called the learned? Lothan asked. Because you have read over 10,000 books, Baxter answered with a rehearsed certainty. They increased the qualification, Lothan said, to 20,000, catalogued and categorized, which I have also exceeded. But that name was earned earnestly and through the years of my life, and I did not read every random thing I could find. Those books were curated carefully for their value to society. And not like the books of fancy and myths that I read, Baxter grumbled, impatiently assuming his master's lesson. Lothan raised his hand to stop his apprentice and lowered it slowly on top of the unbound book he held. Wisdom, he spoke, is the knowledge of age. It is the knowledge of when it is proper to learn things and what is proper to learn. Without knowledge, the mind can be exposed to what it should not know or cannot learn. That is the quality of the learned, and it is one that comes with age. I see, Baxter replied. He was still disappointed, but the value of the lesson was worth more than his personal gripe. Lothan patted the book like it was the boy's head and smiled to send him off. Go on and fix that up first, he instructed. The binders are behind on their orders. They can use your talents best. Yes, Master, Baxter answered. He went off on his own, back down the sturdy stairs, while his master remained up top to look down over the archive. The words Lothan had seen were still inside his head, as if the scribbled ink of the note from the dream had sunken in and stained the backsides of his eyes. He looked down at Baxter, who was just recovering his pace and his attitude, with a solemn regret.
If you're enjoying our audio content, please like and subscribe. It's the best way to help out the channel.